All right. All right. And we are back with another episode of the Media Show. I am your co-host, Craig. With me, as always, the boss, Professor Beth Egan, along with a special
Craig.
guest.
I don't
We
have
have
a
our
t-shirt.
yeah, we need a boss t-shirt for you. I don't know why this hasn't come in. I'm not sure. We have a special guest today. I'm really excited. My history goes back to the days probably just before the great financial meltdown with this guy. What do I call you, John? Producer, showrunner, writer. I mean, it's all packed in there.
Yeah, it's all packed in there. Showrunner is not a term that you will ever see on a credit, a masthead, right. But it's a term of use in the business. Executive producer. I'm a director on this latest project. You name it. I'm jack of all.
Yep, and I know you from your time at 60 Minutes. I know you did some work with one of my favorite shows, Frontline, and the IMDb will be in the description below. We're gonna have a lot of stuff, and we're gonna talk. I don't know. You have a few recent documentaries, which I love, as some of my family will know. I'm a big history buff, so obviously talking anything about World War II, Adolf Hitler, right up my alley. But that's not where we're going to go today. We're going to spend some time talking about America's mayor. We're going to spend some time talking about Universal theme parks, which I think is a fascinating doc. Having lived my own experience at another theme park called Action Park and watched that documentary and had a girlfriend with raspberry burns all over the side of her body from that experience. So I'm interested to hear about your theme park and that whole Universal Studios side of it. But Beth and I, as mentioned, we really have been paying a lot of close attention to the new world of streaming media, CTV. Beth, what do we, Apple TV, Roku, all the way down to the producers themselves and the people that pay for it. So we've switched from kind of network television to these networks, as it were. And we wanted very much to have you on to talk about your experience, since you've been there from the very beginnings, or the side of this where you're in network television and PBS and 60 Minutes and things like that, all the way to today. And we wanted to know your opinion on the state of media and where you think it's gone and where do you think it's going to be going. I know it's a huge question, but we can start there. Hello, Mr. Marks.
Thank you, Craig, for that intro. Professor Egan, great to be here. Look, I think I should start by saying a few things about my background, because I have come through many media, and some are gone now, like news weeklies. I got my start at two small town newspapers, the Plano Star Courier in Plano, Texas, and the Iowa City Press Citizen in Iowa City, Iowa. And so my Iowa City Press Citizen experience, the presses were in the building. So I actually got to hear a city desk reporter yell out, "Stop the presses." And I heard the whole machinery stop. That was back in the day when you clipped articles from newspapers in order to keep a record of the past. You didn't just type in Google, you had clippings. And then I went on to be a reporter in Germany for U.S. News and World Report. I went over as a freelancer to Berlin in 1990. I worked at U.S. News and World Report, not USA Today. U.S. News and World Report was what they called a news weekly. I was a print snob. I swore I'd never do any other medium. I love to write. I'm also a writer of books. For my sins, I then ended up at 60 Minutes in a wonderful job working for Morley Safer, who taught me really. That was my apprenticeship in writing words for picture. So I had been through phases of media, and I've seen this transition. I can still remember when I went to Germany as a freelancer, there was no internet. There were no visual, there was an internet, but there were no visual images. You couldn't transmit directly by simply sending something. So I had these things, these cups, these rubber cups. I don't know if you remember them, but you would take your phone and you would jam it down into these rubber cups and you would dial a number and you hear a screaming, shrieking noise, and your story would be transmitted through those cups to the other side, right? That's how we did it. The first image, this is just gonna, then I'll try to answer your question. The first image I ever saw on screen on a computer, now we're watching everything on computer screens, but the first one I ever saw was a photograph of Vlad the Impaler, the real historical Dracula, for an article I wrote on the Dracula tourism business in Romania. And I can remember watching the screen, these lines would come across the screen. I didn't know what I was going to see. And slowly but surely they filled in, and there was Vlad, an ancient painting of Vlad the Impaler. And I looked at my wife who was with me, and I was like, wow. So that's clearly the future, right? That's what we are seeing right there. So when you ask me what do I think of where we are, it's a vast question. These are shark infested waters now. When I started so I went from Iowa City Press Citizen to Washington, D.C., where I was a clerk for the New York Times. So let's say 1990 is a baseline year. The wall fell in 89. That bureau was run by Hal Raines. Maureen Dowd was a reporter covering the Bush White House. Andy Rosenthal was there. James Reston was there still writing his column. Tom Friedman was still reporting from there, right? This was a place that was at the center of the known universe in media. The gods of broadcast were in their heavens. ABC, CBS, NBC, Fox was not even in existence yet. CNN had begun, but was kind of a, second tier, third tier entity. So I came in, and what I was told by almost everybody from then on, and when I moved to Berlin, I got to know all of the correspondents for all the metros. There were a dozen reporters from a dozen metro papers in Berlin covering that story alone when I moved there. I would go to dinner parties at Los Angeles Times, Miami Herald, Des Moines Register, Dallas Morning News, Boston Globe, in addition to the Times, the Post, the Christian Science Monitor, all those people were there. So, and they all told me, kid, you missed it. You missed it. This is good, but it's all ending. And in our time there, 90 to 95 in Berlin, I saw each one of those bureaus close, except for the Times. I think even the Post was still there when I left, run by Rick Atkinson, who's now a famous historian of American military historian. So I saw that transition, and it was like, okay, so the period of the great metros is over. I went back to New York to work for U.S. News and World Report, covering pop culture, business, Holocaust restitution efforts, kind of you name it, from the Northeast. The Steve Forbes presidential campaign, if anybody remembers that.
Sure. Yeah.
So within 5 years, the news weeklies were on the ropes. And it was kind of clear to me there's not a future in this medium anymore. So I had a friend who was in broadcast, and he said, come on over, the water's fine. And
so wait, John, that's later 90s?
99. So 99, I left U.S. News and World Report right when John F. Kennedy Jr. died. I'd written 2 stories about the Kennedy family. I tried to interview JFK Jr. I ended up doing a documentary for him 2 decades later for A&E. But that's when I left. And at that point, I met with Walter Isaacson at Time, and he was just like, look, that you can see for yourself, this is not a growth industry. So I had a friend at NBC who was at Dateline, and he said, maybe think about 60 Minutes, because they're sort of the last place that still wants print journalism. So that began my career in broadcast and the visual media. And so all this keeps on going to the point now where you look at what's happening at 60 Minutes, and you look what kind of pressure they're under, and you look at how their numbers over the last couple of decades since I was there have kept shrinking. Although I will say 60 is still really successful and has held its audience better than any other place. I love that place. I love those people. My memory of Morley Safer is a wonderful one. But so when I think about this moment, I think 2 things. One is the legacy media is holding on by the skin of its teeth. There are a few people there who are able to survive. So when somebody, say 10 years younger than I am, 20 years younger than I am, thinks about how they got into it, they can still get into those places, and they can still have jobs there to this day. But they're fragile, and their piece of the media pie is just shrinking or embattled and under siege. And after what's happening now between the White House and CBS, and now the New York Times is being sued. So there's that sense of a legacy that, people still talk about mainstream media as if that's this powerhouse juggernaut. And it's not what it was when that term was coined. If anything, they're almost like, I hate to say this, but they're almost like boutique media, right? So then you have that area. The world of social media, of TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, which is now arguably what we used to call the first draft of history, right? When I was a journalist coming up, we said we were writing the first draft of history. It was a common coinage. I can't take credit for it, but it was often said that that's what we're doing. We were the first ones on the scene at a fire. We were the first ones on the scene at the cops and courts every morning. If you're at a daily paper, you do it all. So it was a real first draft of history stuff. And at that point, I remember at the Iowa City Press Citizen, I had a writer I was in a writing program in Iowa, and there was a Yugoslav writer there. And she would come to my office and ask to see the wires. I don't know if you remember the AP wires and the UPI wires, because that was a way to see what was happening in the world before the newspaper came out the next day. So now social media, from TikTok through Instagram to Facebook, wherever you are, that's the first draft of history. And it is chaotic and not easy to trust and shifts with the wind and is stratified by opinion and steeped in opinion and not easy to know whether you're looking at a real thing or a fake thing, a setup or not. That world is a lava flow. And, so for someone like me, if I were to think about, well, how do you responsibly into those waters? I never figured it out. And basically, I've left Twitter and I've left Facebook and Instagram because for me, that it's a tainted source for information. The things I loved about it are the incidental fun things. And so, but nevertheless, if you're being serious about thinking through this problem, that's a whole area where people get their news, maybe where most people get their news. And the younger you are, the more likely that is. So
yeah, that brings back, I wanted to roll the clock back a little bit because you said something really important when it comes to local media, which is, so I just want to clarify the time frame. You go over to Germany for the Berlin Wall, basically end of communism, where we're seeing this kind of full blast. By 95, you said that everybody was gone. Essentially, it was everybody had picked up stakes and gone back to the States, and really only the Times and maybe a couple others are still lingering and with actual reporters on the ground, right?
Yes. So when I went to Berlin in 1990, it was not necessarily commonly agreed upon that foreign international news was a lost leader. A lot of those reporters that were in Berlin would go to Iraq, right? We got there in 90, the invasion happens. A lot of those reporters left, but the bureau stayed open. But over the course of the next 5 years, the bureau started to close and they weren't going to reopen. And we were close friends with the New York Times reporter at the time, John Talibou, and Paula Budarini, his wife. They had been reporters during the fall of communism. They'd been to Poland. They were in a bureau at Poland. So they stayed. But most of the other people and the Post stayed. But most of the other bureaus closed up and left. U.S. News and World Report, I did have a successor who stayed there after me. But within a few years, they were gone too. So in the 90s, that was one of the first moments where you knew that the power of the Metro paper with overseas bureaus all over the world really was waning. They could no longer afford to do that themselves, so they would outsource it to wires or other syndicated versions of their stuff. So that was a moment that was clear. It was a withdrawal of a vast media empire around the world that was never replaced. So then there are the local. You asked about local papers, so I started local papers, and I have a deep. That's my J school, right? So in Plano, I covered religion, and I covered healthcare. We had a bureau of about 12 people, all very young, making 18 grand a year, maybe. So broke. It was love. We all did it We all had the bug. We would run around to fires, cops in courts. My religion beat was incredible. In Plano, Texas, everyone was there. I covered a planning and zoning commission where a group of Hindu faithful wanted to build a Hindu temple in Allen, Texas, which had nothing but a street of Protestant churches. And those meetings were unbelievable, just fiery clashes between worlds and cultures, but, unfolding in incredible detail. And there I was, 22 years old, covering it, and given enormous amounts of space in that paper, front page, to write about that. Religion was everything you can imagine there. And so, and then when I went to Iowa City, I covered the schools and I covered business. And the schools were, if you just want to take that as an example about what we've lost with the loss of local papers, that paper, the Iowa City Press Citizen, I believe is still there today. The printing press is long gone, but I have been in so many newsrooms since as a documentarian. We do a lot of interviews with reporters in various places. The Modesto Bee is an example. So I went to Modesto to interview people for a documentary for A&E about the Scott Peterson case. Scott and Laci Peterson, I don't know if you remember, but it was a famous murder case in the early
Sure.
Yep. So I was in the Modesto Bee newsroom with the reporter who kind of owned that story. And half of that office, it was a huge office. The Modesto Bee, even 20 years ago, had a large staff. When I got in there, half of it was in the dark with desks on the table. In the last 2 or 3 years before I got there, the newsroom had been decimated. So you had about 8 people, maybe 10 people sitting up front where the lights were, and the back half of that office was dark. So
where do you go now? If you're doing a documentary on a similar topic, let's say the next version of Laci Peterson, the whole thing, you won't arrive to a newsroom like that. There's nobody there in the Sacramento Bee anymore. There's not 17 people sitting in a news bullpen. What's your strategy as a documentarian or somebody who's going to report on this? Like, what are you going to go to Nextdoor? Are you going to go to Reddit? Like, where do you get the information, John? Like, how are these stories going to come to light? Which is one of the great things that we're going to, hopefully we'll get to is Julie K. Brown's reporting, on Jeffrey Epstein out of, McClatchy's Miami Herald down in Florida. But let's put that aside for a moment. Like, what are if your strategy was that back then, and that's not that long ago,
right
now, what is it? What do you see? What would you have to do if you were covering a case like that?
Well, I want to back up for a second.
Okay.
One of the things that we are losing in this country, in addition to the popular connection that people in small towns and small cities had to their papers, is institutional support at the highest level for journalism in this country, for real, honest, serious journalism. And the way that a lot of us learned that in my era was to start at these local papers where you had a crusty editor and a city editor who would teach you, right? By sitting you out in the field and say, kid, this is a shitty, excuse my language, this is not good. Go back in, you're staying all night. We won't make tomorrow's paper, but we'll make the next one. That. But even with the failure of the institutions, right? Meaning the sense that our largest corporations, our largest media corporations, our government, our local governments, our state governments see the need for and the desire and have the desire for a free and independent media that they consider to be an unalloyed good for the entire population. Even without that, what you're left with is the discipline. So I really think it's important to say, what am I talking about here? What are we talking about here? If you ask me where I could go if I just wanted any old person to tell a story, there are plenty of people who have megaphones all over the country who don't know what they're talking about, whose facts are not accurate, who you could go to, and that might be entertaining television, but you wouldn't get the truth. Right?
Like so Turtle Boy.
Pardon?
Like Turtle Boy.
Yes, like Turtle Boy. There's a long list of people who are just voices, and TV loves big personalities, and they love voices that are willing to say anything. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is fact-based reported truth, where a pattern of truth allows you to construct a narrative where people can look at it and say, this is our best guess at what happened here, whether that's a murder, whether it's a business scam, whether it's a disaster on the coast. So when I am talking about this kind of reporting, and you can stop me now and tell me if this is not what you want to hear, but I feel like
no, this exactly. Well, I want to say that's exactly why I framed it in terms of you coming in to do a documentary, because you would want the facts. You've, in other words, we get past all of the, the initial, like the disaster on the coast example is great. You get past the first 3-4 days, and then from day 5 to day 365, before you parachute in and say, we're going to do a documentary about what went wrong here. Where are you going? Like, in other words, is there going to be a local paper in Newport News and Charleston that's going to have a newsroom, is going to have 5 different people who you could talk to? No, I don't believe that. I mean, I know that a lot of those people are gone. I don't need anybody to tell me that. So what do? It means makes your job as a documentarian much harder, I would assume.
It does, but in a way, it takes you back to the roots of it all. You become the local reporter. You need time, right? If you don't have time, you're in trouble. I think national news broadcasts that have to hit a deadline every day, they have a bigger problem than I do as a documentarian. If I decide that I'm going to do a story on a true crime tale, some part of the country, I'm generally given enough time to get in there and get on the ground. And yes, a lot of the local media is gone, but depending on the case, depending on the story, you can start to find people. And when you pull on those threads, you will find locals who have credible information. You will find somebody who covers schools on a website who actually is not bad at what they do. These are scraps compared to what was there before, which you cannot ever assume. One, you cannot assume that anything that you find on the internet is worth a damn. So I wouldn't trust any of that. I would double, triple, quadruple check any of that. But then you have to go and you get on the ground and you start making calls and you become the local reporter and you just work as hard and fast as you can. And every bit of your judgment is on the line because you don't have anybody who's pre-vetted the information. You have to make judgment calls about who's a reliable player, who may be feeding you false information, who maybe doesn't have the whole story, but thinks they do. All that stuff falls on the documentary team. So when I choose my teams, I choose reporter types and writer types, because the second part of this is not just the reporting of it, it's knowing, because in these environments, it's very hard to learn on the job. Like with a documentary where you're given a big chunk of money to get the job done, you need people who know how to report, and you need people who know how to distill all that information into an understandable narrative that is at the same time dead accurate, right? And if they can't get there, they know where the holes are. Right? Because the nightmare, the mortification for any serious journalist is you got it wrong. It's not whose side are you on. It's not adjudicating, well, they said this, we need to balance it with that. No, the point is you've got to get it right. And will you go where you need to go to get it right? And if you don't get it right, and I don't just mean like a central thesis, I mean anything. When I was a print reporter, if I misspelled a name, I was utterly mortified. And most of the people I worked with were the same, right? So that's the issue. You're working relatively quickly and you get on the ground and you flood the zone with as many people as you can who know what they're doing. And still you have to fact check it all, right? And you need your facts to be corroborated. And if you have a fact that you think is worth including because there's some viability to it and you still can't prove it out with 2 or 3 other corroborations, then you have to lose it. And maybe all this is happening at a fast pace. Without those people that you're talking about, it's like there's a racing river between you and the truth, right? Yeah. And you kind of have to swim that river and get over there and get back as much as you can. And also there's this. How many more people am I going to find who have these news values and the ability to distill them into stories for an audience to absorb sensibly and coherently? That's my greater worry. Honestly, it's not that there's nobody there local on the ground. It's that I'm going to start running out of people who can do this work.
Well, as someone who works in a journalism school, and see us, we're getting rid of people who teach writing and adding people who teach AI. And you're right, John. These people, we're worried. What we talk about within Newhouse is where the jobs are going to go, where the kid's going to have the opportunity. But I think what we're missing is if we double down on teaching them how to use AI, then they're not doing all those things that you said.
Well, that's a great point with AI. I mean, here's what I feel about AI for reporters. I would say, I mean, look, I'm beware, because the act of gleaning information through phone calls and shoe leather and archival research of your own is the act of knowing it emotionally. So committing to a story because you earned that information. If a huge chunk comes to you through AI, you bear no responsibility for it. You're essentially signing off on a box and saying, yeah, you know, I've double checked this or that. But the act of research for a reporter is the act of becoming invested. It's the time you're investing. So then you also know your story, and you also feel I'm accountable to who I'm talking to, right? If the AI is feeding you 3/4 of the story and what you're doing is cherry picking, looking for the best subjects here and there, also you miss stuff. And I'm not even getting to the question of hallucinations within the AI. For me as a journalist, if I know that AI has hallucinations, which are essentially falsehoods, I'm never using it, right? Never, because what is a hallucination? How much of how much territory is covered by an AI hallucination? So even if I manage to double and triple check every piece of information that I'm getting from an AI algorithm, am I missing something that the hallucination is simply omitted? So that's tragic for me to hear that. I believe in this concept in shitification, coined by a New York Times reporter not so long ago, where there's a degradation in all digital media that happens over time. Social media started out as a miracle. The iPhone started out as a miracle. Computers and refrigerators started out as miracles. And slowly over time, as we all get addicted, there's less of an incentive to hook us, to make it excellent, and everything enshittifies. And I think AI is going to enshittify faster than anything, because the convenience of just buying information in bulk for an individual reporter is just too easy, right? I'll throw out the groceries I don't want. I'll take that. I'll take that. Anyway.
Well, I agree with you. And I want to go back quickly to the hallucination. And I know that's the term that is sort of accepted within this topic. But the problem I have with the term hallucination is it implies that there's some thinking that's going on within the AI. And that's what people are missing when they're using it. It is magic. I use it all the time in certain particular ways. But the reason that it's missing these things is because there is no context to it. It's analyzing text, converting it to zeros and ones, doing mathematical equations, and spitting something out that even the people who wrote the algorithms don't know why it's spitting out the output. And, you know, that's my fear, and how deeply, especially I teach advertising, so we've been putting shit out for years. But, you know, especially in the journalism professions, the fact that we are so focused on making sure our students know how to use AI, you don't have to teach anybody how to use AI. If you don't know how to use it, ask AI how to use it. It'll tell you.
Right, right.
But it is, you know, hallucinating.
My AI, to that point, before you go, I actually got a compliment from my AI. Oh, that was a good prompt. My first time ever, but
it will encourage you and all of that. But yeah, it's exactly what you're saying, John. It misses that context that only you can get from speaking to the right person and understanding where they're coming from and how their version of the truth fits into the broader picture of the truth.
So can I jump in? I wanted to give you guys another. I wanted to talk about Donna Hanover's husband, but now because we're deep into this, I really feel like this is going to really segue really nicely into the topic that I'm going to throw at you both, and I want to hear your opinions. I'm gonna, as Beth knows, you don't know, John. I did not pay a lot of attention to Jeffrey Epstein trial information. It was just not something that flew, you know, far more likely to spend time looking up Betheg Holvig and talk about World War I and World War II and causations in 19th century. I just didn't pay attention.
I picked up your
I'm kind of, Oh, good. I know you did. So I over the last 6 months, I've really kind of dug back into it. And what I'm fascinated at, after kind of reading the original reporting from Julie K. Brown and getting a lot of that information, is this exactly what you're talking about? Because that story breaks in 2017. It is 2025. Now, I know we had some COVID in between. I know we had some stuff, but that's a long road for a story that is, I mean, it feels very open and shut to me as I'm reading it. But I want you two to kind of say, like, I mean, is this the problem that you saw, John, that back in 1990 into 1995, when all these kind of newsrooms are kind of like abandoning ship? Because I knew it was back then. Because I do know a couple people, Bill Holliber and Ira Ellenthal, and the people at U.S. News and World Report, and then they went to the Daily News, right? Like all these people who were on the business side trying to make the math work, and everything kind of shuts down. And here we are looking at this outrageous story, which, dare I say, might change political climate, and change, things with a sitting president and all these different stuff. How was this not a bigger story? Is that a failure of the media? Has the media, which is this kind of, what is it? The fourth wall, it's just interesting for me to look at it from my position, not knowing much about it, then kind of learning a little bit, and whoa, this guy was doing some dastardly stuff. I mean, the latest information to come out, the drawings, not just the Trump drawing, but the drawing with the kids with the balloons, and then the guy, I mean, this is bananas, right? Like, we're talking about some, and whatever, the interview with Ghislaine Maxwell, where, she said basically half the cabinet is in there. I mean, how did this not get opened up earlier is my question. I guess we'll start there.
Professor Egan, do you want to jump into these shark-infested waters first? Or I'm happy to answer, but I mean, that's a huge and good question.
Yeah, I know it's big, but it's an interest. I mean, to me, it's just shocking after not paying attention to it, then reading about it and going, wait, why wasn't this covered? I don't remember any of this kind of. I remember the trial. I remember, obviously, the video over and over again with the missing moments where he's committing suicide, however happens in there. But outside of that, I don't feel like that we dug in. Is this a combination of the press not really being involved or not able to be involved, and people protecting it on the governmental side? I'm just stunned at where we are right now. This was going to be our third topic, but I feel like we're talking about this.
Well, I'll say a few things. For sure, I feel like the deterioration of our local media probably played a role. The first time I ever heard the term news deserts was in the aughts, around the time this first story broke. Second, I would say, and it's appalling to have to say this, but I feel that it plays a role. I don't think we took these allegations of sexual abuse against women very seriously until much more recently. And I think these cries for help and these horrible stories landed in a vacuum. I think even newsrooms that consider themselves responsible would simply say, well, rich guy, young women. I mean, what is this really? So that's the second thing. Third thing is, we tend to worship wealth and power in this country. And I don't think newsrooms are exempt from that. And I think there's probably some sense of that involved as well. I'm not trying to excuse
that
any
makes
of
sense.
it. But I think beyond all that, I will say this, and it's not so much a defense as my sense of what happens when a story begins to take that escalator up and become the story of the day. And I think about the Scott Peterson case here. So when the Scott Peterson case broke, I was at 60 Minutes and I didn't get it at all. And to be honest with you, in some ways, I mean, I do get it more now. I do. But we were in the lead up to a war that was going to end up killing tens of thousands of people. And it was clear it was going to be devastating. And every one of us in the Bureau were trying to work as fast as we could to get out as much information as we could about what this would be. And then there was this story that was on every channel, and it was a whole baked narrative. There was a missing pregnant woman and a shifty husband, and lo and behold, a bombshell blonde mistress, and Nancy Grace declared he was guilty, before the body was discovered. So you had a narrative that was very simple and easy, and they all went for it. And my role in this, Scott Peterson for A&E, and I'm proud to say that one of our attorneys in that said it's one of the first times he's ever seen public opinion shift as a result of a documentary. Our documentary kind of shifted public thinking for the first time to the possibility that he's innocent and that she was killed by burglars who were across the street that she possibly stumbled upon. In any case, that was a miscarriage of media, simply for the fact that everyone rushed in and took on the story because it was great television and people were watching, and it was irresistible soap opera, right? So that dominated the whole period when we went to war in Iraq. Mm-hmm. And I would say it was the true crime story of that era. Epstein now it's cosmological for millions of people on the one hand, and for people on the other hand, it's so atrocious and horrible, and it may involve some of the most powerful people in the world, that it's clear that this is something that we should have all been paying attention to. But at the time, because of the culture, because of the way journalists' minds work, because of the emphasis of tons of resources on a foreign war, 2 foreign wars, the collapse of the economy, 2008, right? The Great Recession. So who's got time for a rich guy who has an obsession with young girls? So that mix, to me, accounts for why the story got buried the first time. And of course, the other thing is a lot of journalism is only as good as its sources. Not all, but a lot of journalism depends upon insiders who are willing to talk. And obviously, an enterprising reporter was able to get there by 2017, but Jeffrey Epstein was very powerful. And if his clients included Donald Trump and Bill Clinton and God knows who else, then a lot of money was paid, perhaps, or a lot of mouths were shut. The sources, I've always assumed the sources were not great. Here's where, and I look to you all to maybe give me a sense of this, because you probably know more than I do. What I can't understand is why, when he died in that prison cell, that didn't become the biggest story in the country for months.
Yes.
Because that smelled bad to everybody. If you weren't paying attention up until that point, and then you heard even a couple of the details, like his minders fell asleep. Mm-hmm. For that one moment, the cameras were turned off. If you didn't smell something awful then you were not winnable to that kind of a story. And so for me, that's when I thought, why abdicate at that point? All the facts are known. This guy's clearly guilty. Powerful people are involved. He's likely to tell the full story. And then all of a sudden he's dead under ridiculous circumstances that make it kind of look like something out of Goodfellas. So, as a story, you think, well, and then nothing. I mean, I can remember the Times doing a big spread on the whole thing as if it was just like, yeah. And so there was just this window and he hung himself, and that was that. So now, that to me, those are all in my mind how I think about this. But what about, and so that, but I would say, and where we all land though is now this is existential. Mm-hmm. Right? Because of everything that's contained in this story, now for some people, it looks existential. Some of the most powerful people in the world, it looks existential. For a huge number of people, it's a source of meaning. It's religious. So sometimes, these stories do happen and they take time to evolve, and then they become definitional. The Manson case it didn't start out this way. It became the story of how the 60s ended. That was largely due to Bugliosi, the attorney, writing a book that captured the imagination of the world and defined it as such. Okay, race, power, sex, all in one thing. That case is still with us. Both of those cases are still with us. So this is that case for our time, very clearly.
Mhm.
I mean, yeah, it's the amount of people and the time of when everything happened, and then 2017. So we're talking about the 90s, right? I mean, you guys need to help me a little bit on the math here. He's doing most of this from the late 80s into the 90s, and then it's kind of broken in 2017, right? Long after his, after the breakup with Donald at Mar-a-Lago, whatever goes on there. So he's doing it all those years. Hence why when you're looking at, what was it, a week ago, in front of the Capitol, you have a throng of women. It's a huge amount. That's only a small percentage.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So I'm just stunned. To me, it was a story that I didn't know. And I lived in New York in that time period, and I partied. I mean, I was not partying with that crew, but I was in the city. I knew some of the, some of the places that they were. Occasionally would eventually get in, but wow.
Well, that was my 6 degrees of separation. I was in Antigua in 2005, on a day trip on a boat, and the captain says, "Oh, an American owns that island over there." We're like, "What's his name?" "Jeffrey Epstein." Never heard of him. I'm like, how is someone so wealthy that he owns this island and I've never even heard of him? But John, I think you're right. You've got to get to the inside, and the inside essentially were the women. And we were living in a world, and we still are to a large extent, where the women get victim shamed. So who is going to give it up? I hope to God that they do release that list. They said last week, a couple weeks ago, we'll write the list. We know who these people are. I'd be shocked if we ever see that from them.
Did you see the Bloomberg FOIA files piece where they went through what happened with all that material? It was so heavily redacted, and Trump's name was blotted out every single time it came up, and so were the names of every other powerful person on that list for privacy considerations. So I think it's called Article 6, and then Article 7C is anything that would materially damage someone by mere mention in a story, in a file like that. So it's not going to happen through FOIA, which is the chief way that we might get that. One other thing I would say about this, though, that's pretty clear to me is look at the Weinstein case. Look how many people knew about that. And those are very powerful public people. He was doing that in the same period as Epstein was. And these two cases cannot be seen separately. And the silence with Harvey Weinstein was very close to the silence around Epstein. The difference is that at some point, Weinstein's friends weren't powerful enough. Did you see the email exchange between Peter Mandelson, our ambassador to the UK, and Epstein? This is 2007 and 8. After all that stuff comes out, and then Mandelson is telling him, "I love you. I'm your friend. How can I help you? What can I do for you?" When the truth comes out, right? That is the level of power we're talking about here. Epstein had bought off and compromised huge chunks of powerful people. That's where the conspiracy stuff, to me, doesn't need to be fanciful to understand that here was a guy who understood very well that what he was doing. I mean, you know what? I've just been reading Lolita of all books, because it's an amazing book, but also it feels very much in line with this moment. And if you look at the strategy of the madman Humbert in that novel, he goes to these extraordinary lengths to conceal his tracks, even when coincidence strikes and can compromise him. And all he's got to do is neutralize a handful of people in his environment who know about him. But he's very canny about all that. He knows the role he's playing, and he knows he's committing an awful crime. Nabokov wants you to know he knows. He knows this is horrible, but he cannot stop himself. Epstein knew, and he was unbelievably canny about buying off everybody who he thought might be a problem. And the mistake he made was imagining that women don't count. That women in these cases will not be believed. He counted on that. Harvey counted on that. Harvey had a whole team that smeared the reputations of anyone who spoke out against him. Epstein had the same thing. So maybe you can see if there's a silver lining in this horrible case, which obviously there really isn't, But one thing you can see is maybe a growth curve of understanding about whose voices count. Who are we going to listen to? And in some funny way, in a weird way, the voices of those women strike me as one of the very few areas where we all agree, right? Everyone can agree. This cannot simply be shoved under the rug. Like they're there. Something happened to them. They've named the guy. He's dead now. And all these, so, you know, Craig, look, the answer to your question is that some story, like here's a question, why didn't it go away? Right? Why didn't it successfully get buried after he was convicted, after he committed suicide, after, you know, it was acknowledged as a crime? It's still with us. That's kind of amazing. That's a flip side to your question.
Yeah, that is, and I have thought of that. But again, I think that, I mean, I guess to my original point, and I think something that Beth and I have talked about quite often is, you know, my thought on this is if there was a robust, you know, local media newsroom covering this in 2018, 2019, 2020, you know, would this be bigger? Would this already be out? Like, I think part of it is people like myself who knew about it but didn't dive deep into it. I thought, just as you said earlier, and I'm guilty of this, of like, well, rich guy around, you know, people who want to be around rich people, weird stuff happens. You know, I don't know. I'm and I know a lot about the Weinstein stuff. And again, that's also part of that same kind of narrative. You know, oh well, you know, you want to be coming up and the casting couch kind of play, as it were. But in this particular case, by 2017, 2018, we know a lot. Is my point. And I think that from 2017 forward, because the aughts, we do see the end of the newsroom. This is a great example of, at least I believe, of we didn't have enough local journalists in New York and South Florida covering this and understanding what's going on there. And maybe if they were, like you said, kind of starstruck, like, well, they're billionaires, they own islands in faraway places. What can we really do? But yeah, that's an interesting. I mean, it's a. Look. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
There was a local paper, and the local paper did cover the original.
Yeah.
And I have a much snarkier answer to your question, and as to why it didn't go away, and that's because Ghislaine didn't take off to a country with a non-extradition treaty on it.
Yeah.
It really did get kind of silenced until they found her and grabbed her, and then all of a sudden it came back again. And that's always my big question with these folks is, man, get out of Dodge where they can't touch you.
Yeah. No, I think you've got a really good point there. But Craig, I will say, I kind of agree with you. I think there's a world in which, you know, these small papers, sometimes one of them would win a Pulitzer Prize for their coverage. There's a small town in Texas called Lufkin. And that paper, the Lufkin newspaper, won multiple Pulitzers over years. It was a point of pride. So you'd have teams in South Florida, you would have teams of editors and reporters in small towns who could have tracked down maybe more women, brought more force to bear. I mean, I think a lot about the story of the Pentagon Papers and how the Washington Post successfully and the Times fought back and took it all the way to the Supreme Court and basically had the institution of the law behind them. But there's a moment where all of a sudden all of the press in the country rallies behind them. Mm-hmm. All those op-ed pages rallies behind the Post and the Times to say, we're in this with you. Mm-hmm. The government cannot force you not to publish. That power is part of what you're talking about. It's the sense that the rich and powerful have to fear a lively, engaged press at every level. And I think half of that at least is gone, probably more. What people are more concerned about is making a scene in a restaurant and getting caught on an iPhone. But even there, clearly, they don't fear it that much, right? That's an infraction that can be survived. What Epstein, what he's involved in, what all those people are involved in, is something that requires a deep bench of reporting at many levels. And So we simply don't have that now.
Mhm.
And so we rely on a handful of outlets. That's why Trump's doing what he's doing with the Times and he did with 60, is because he knows that those are the last outlets that have the power to do any kind of challenging reporting to enormous interests, whether they be corporate or governmental. And, part of the reason they're fragile is because that layer, it's like, it's like an ecosystem. Those papers also fed reporters up. People got experience at a small town newspaper, then they'd go from, say, Plano, Texas to the Dallas Morning News. And for the Dallas Morning News, they try to win their Pulitzer, and then they go to the Times or the Post, and maybe some of those people would end up in broadcast. Anyway, yes, we've lost a lot of that ecosystem, and it's cost us.
I think it's cost us. It's cost, unfortunately, a lot of people in really compromised situations that have been taken advantage of by criminals like Epstein. I can safely say that, and whomever else. And I really am fearful that, whether it was Craigslist, Wikipedia, Yahoo falling into Google and everybody else, that it just changed the way, media is supported. And we've really lost it. I don't know. I'm wondering, I'm seeing sparks of this with video, right? So maybe the open web will remain as it were if you had enough video, and video seems to be monetizable more than the written word, which is devastating in a different way, but maybe perhaps, this will be able to, at least help some of it. But I don't see that as a cure for this. This is a big problem. It's a big problem for us to face. If you're thinking Nextdoor is going to replace your local paper for hard-hitting information about, some corrupt landlord or some, high school basketball coach that's taken money or whatever else, think again. It's just not going to do it. And I think that's where we're sitting. I just wanted to say this: we're coming up to 4:00, and I desperately, John, and I know I want to talk about Rudy, and I want to talk about your other projects. Can we? I would pause here, and we can bring this back. I have another one after this. So I wanted to just see whether or not you guys are we could stop here for sure, and then we can pick this up in a part 2. I think would be a really great thing. I mean, I'm really interested in talking about Rudy and about the fall of America's mayor, because I'm a New Yorker, Beth's a New Yorker. We saw it all. I mean, I really saw it all with him. I don't know, Beth, were you here for all those years? Were you here for Dinkins? And
I moved right before the election. And so, I voted for Dinkins and then lived through the Giuliani years.
Yeah, I'm really interested in talking about that as well. But this was an enlightening amount of information from a real journalist, which is something that we've both been really interested in, and we're bringing more on. That's for sure. And I would love to have you back, John.
Sure. Yes. I'd be glad to come back and talk Rudy and all of that for sure.
And we definitely have to talk about Universal.
There's a lot to tell. I'll just put a plug in now. That's on September 29th on Peacock, dropping all 3 episodes. And it's a blast. And I have to say, I've never done anything like it in my directing and show running career. And it was incredible. It was incredible to watch this place come up, like get the last piece of it get built, all these engineers and production designers and choreographers pulling together to like get it across the line. And with the shadow of a terrible opening in June of 1990 for the original Orlando Universal theme park hanging over them. So I'd love to talk about it. I'm very proud of it.
Yeah, we gotta talk about that.
It's more fun than talking about the horrors of the Epstein case.
Yeah, the unfortunate horrors of the Epstein case. So with that, we're gonna close out another edition. John, I want to thank you, Beth, as always, insightful, bringing us information from the Caribbean. which I appreciate today. That's fantastic.
Caribbean intel.
John, you in Plano, Texas, and all that stuff, and Sioux City, Iowa, where we're really reaching all the world here. Thank you guys. This was a lot of fun for me. And with that, we are going to come back with John Mark soon. We're going to talk theme parks, Rudy Giuliani. Do those two things go together? And we'll be back on the media show soon. So thank you very much, everybody, and don't forget to subscribe.
Thank y'all.